Well, good evening. We're so glad you braved the rain to come here and worship with us tonight. Please stand while we sing praises, celebrate all of God's goodness.
Well, good evening. You can have a seat, please. So good to have you in worship tonight, and welcome to the Grace Place. And did you enjoy that? Let's give the band a great big thank you as you do that. All right. So good to see you, and I hope you've had a good week. And there's really no better way to start a new week than doing what we're doing right now. And so I want to really encourage you to let God work in a special way in your life through what all happens in this service, through the music and the message and all the other aspects of what we'll be doing tonight. So we're glad you're here. If you've not taken time to put your name tag on, that was in your program. I'd invite you to get that out and put that on, and we'll be greeting each other in just a moment, and that's always helpful. And if you'll take time, fill out that little response card, put that in the offering buckets later whenever they're passed, that would be great. If you're here for the first time or you haven't been here for a long time, I'd invite you to stop by our welcome area, and we'd love to have a chance to see you and meet you. And also we have a gift we'd like to give you as well. We're delighted you're here. Let's stand together, greet each other, and let's have a great time of celebrating together.
rich on God's terms? What are true riches? Let's discover what God says about being rich in what matters most.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Grace Place again. We're so glad you're here. And before I share the message with you, I'd like Dave and Linda Cantrell to come up here if they would. And some of you know them, some of you don't. But this is a very special month for Dave and Linda. And they started attending the Grace Place, and it was Community Bible Chapel back then, 40 years ago. They must have started at about 3 years old, didn't they?
We did.
Anyway, I think that is an amazing thing. And, you know, I've seen people, you know, they change churches like I change socks, you know. And I've always said that there's a lot of people when they get to heaven, they're going to stay there as long as there's not a better heaven 5 miles down the road, you know. And so anyway, but we are, you know, one of the things that I just want to do is say thank you for your deep commitment to the church. You guys have been here shortly after it began, seen it go through all kinds of phases and stages, and whenever you guys started attending, I need somebody to bring him out a mic. Is there somebody back there? Yeah. Okay. When you guys started attending the church was not on Salerno Road. Is that correct? And so this property was bought since you guys have been coming. Is that correct? And you built the chapel building and the preschool building. Just kind of highlight a few things that's maybe been part of that journey. Because I know you guys have been involved in a myriad of things in the church.
Thanks for the warning, by the way. My mind has to think back all that. But, you know, I mean, when we first started out, it was just, oh yeah, you know, we just need someplace bigger, you know. We're growing, and we were on 3 different sites before we were here. And then when we came to here, we helped physically build the buildings, and the guys would come up after work, you know, and nail those nails and everything. But it was just always with a vision in mind, you know. It was just always building God's kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been really neat to be part of it, raising our kids here, you know, and it's just our church.
Well, very, very good. And Dave, I know you've been involved at one point with students and Linda, you was involved in children's ministries and a myriad of other things.
Back in the day, you know, put your hand in the air, you're a selected volunteer, but you know that's what we want to do. That's where our heart is. We want to build God's kingdom, and you know, when you see the need that needs to be fulfilled and a role that needs to be jump in and do something, that's what we've done our entire life. Built these buildings, and we moved chairs, and the preschool was Sunday school, and on Sundays and preschool during the week, we'd put chairs out Sunday morning and put them away Sunday after church, and week after week after week. And just many things happened. Bus ministry, I worked for the youth, she worked for the children, she had VBS. And then started out in Golden Gate on Hawthorne on the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They had a Saturday night, we had a Sunday. So the devil really had us confused in that church for the weekend. You know, he didn't know what to do. But then, like Linda said, two other different locations we've come over here. But we've been so blessed. The ride has been unbelievable. We've seen God do so many things. And we stand here together telling you that God is alive, God is well, and God has a plan for each one of our lives. And being part of the Grace Place is probably one of the highlights of our life. Mm-hmm. And when Rick and Karen came, like we've known Rick, in the middle 60s. So we go way back together from Ohio. And Rick and Karen being here has really just taken off. God has blessed. God has done miraculous things. And guess what? Greater days are yet to come. We're still excited. Grace Place is our church, and we believe in the Grace Place. And God bless Rick and Karen for the work they're doing here.
Dave mentioned we've known each other since the 60s. I met Dave and Linda when they were probably about 13 or 14 years old. And
she rocked the cradle.
Yeah, and anyway, a lot of you have no idea what a camp meeting's like, but I grew up going to camp meetings, And that is not like going to a KOA, by the way, okay? It's not. And, camp meeting is generally in a rural area, and they have where people will bring in campers, and they'll bring in, some people have little cottages on there, and then they have this big barn-type facility that they call the tabernacle, and then they'd preach at least 3 sermons a day, and most of them were hellfire, brimstone, spit 3 or 4 rows out type sermons, okay, is what they were. And Dave and Linda, we attended a camp called Victory Camp in Ohio, and Dave and Linda, they worked in the ice cream shop or whatever it was, and I first met them then, and that's just amazing that, how your lives kind of go this way and then they come this way. And I've always said that, we ought to be really careful about how some of us blow up bridges in our lives, because you never know when those relational connections you have with somebody else is a bridge that God uses for your future. And I want to encourage us to keep that in mind. We have a little something that we just want to give you just to let you know we appreciate you. And it says, maybe you want to just read it, Linda, okay?
40 years at the Grace Place, David and Linda. Thank you for
investing your talents and by serving in so many ways.
We couldn't even begin to list it, so I had to put it so many ways. How about that? And because Dave and Linda have served in probably several dozen different areas of ministry responsibility over those 40 years. Give them a great big thank you. Would you guys do that? God bless you guys. Well, I'm going to continue the series of messages that we started 3 weekends ago that we've entitled Being Rich in What Matters the Most. And as I've told you before, we're not talking about how to get rich. If you want to figure that out, wake up about 3 o'clock in the morning, turn on an infomercial, and they'll tell you all the things that you can spend your money on to get rich. And I tell you what, there are more crazy things they're selling and more crazy ideas than you can imagine it happened at 3 o'clock in the morning on TV. But anyway, I thank you so much for being here tonight, and a big thank you to Dave and Linda for just an amazing commitment to the church. But I'm going to talk to you tonight about the test of prosperity. And this is the 4th message in this series. If you've not been here on previous weekends, I'd invite you to go to our website, and if you go to the sermon section and then click on archives, all of the previous messages are there. And it's not that one is required to understand the next one, but it gives you a more comprehensive understanding of what God says about riches and what he says about being rich in the things that matter the most. And, we talked about a variety of things. We started off this series by talking to you about the good news and the bad news. And anyone remember what the good news is? What's the good news? We're rich. The bad news is what? We're rich. Okay. And then we talked about some other things, that why it's so foolish to trust in riches. And we talked about how God wants to be first in our finances. And those are all wonderful things that we need to be focusing our attention on. But I would say this, that God says, whenever I bless you in your life materially, then that is a test. And we're going to look at several passages that help us to have a better understanding of what the test of prosperity is. And I'm not going to look at the passage yet, but I invite you to turn to Luke chapter 12, because we're going to look at 2 different sections in Luke 12. I'm also going to briefly look at Matthew chapter 6. But I want to just share with you how important it is to understand that, God wants us to see this whole thing of being rich. And as I've shared with you over these past 3 weekends, all of us are amazingly rich. And you remember how much money a person has to make to be within the top 1% of wage earners on the planet? How much is it? $33,000 a year, all right? if you make $80,000 or more a year, then you're in the top 0.1% of wage earners on the planet. And that comes from globalwealth.org. I believe it's Wealth or Riches, which place I got it. But anyway, so that's where it comes from studies of that. If you own an automobile, you're in the top 3% of the wealthiest people on this planet. So just keep in mind that all of us are amazingly blessed and all of us are rich, because our tendency is to look at it, and when God talks about wealth and talks about riches, we think of people like Solomon, and we think of people that live in exclusive areas in our community. We think of people that drive a certain kind of an automobile, have a label of some sort on their jeans. I mean, we've got all these ideas of what rich people are, when in reality, all of us are rich. So when God talks about riches and talks about wealth, he's talking to every one of us in this room. And so let me take a few minutes before I look at those passages and just highlight a couple things that I think are important. And that is, first of all, that prosperity can change us for the better or the worse. Changes either the better or the worse. And, I think you've probably heard this expression, money changes people. And, and that's true. It changes people in some very, very significant kinds of ways. And it can change us either for the better or it can change us for the worse. Whenever money changes us for the worse, we become arrogant, overly confident, sometimes rude and selfish. You say, Rick, not everybody, and that's for sure not everyone. But the bottom line boils down to being that many times the more we have, the more self-absorbed we become, and sometimes the more arrogant we become, looking down on people who do not have what we have. And that to me is a terrible tragedy. But whenever wealth changes us for the good, then, if we're deeply committed to Jesus Christ, money can change us for the better. Because when it changes us for the better, we become humble. We recognize that we're the recipient of blessings and gifts that we don't deserve. And it produces humility in our lives. And we understand that what God has given us can be taken away in a flash. So we deal with life on a very different level when we are deeply committed to Jesus Christ and we are blessed in some way, financially or materially in our lives. See, when money changes for the better, we also become more grateful. And some of the most grateful people I've ever met are also simultaneously some of the most financially blessed people that I've ever met. And then when money changes us for the better, we'll become more generous. And we talked about generosity last weekend. And then when money changes us for the better, it gives us a very, very strong awareness that we are responsible to take those gifts that God's given to us, those resources God's given to us, and we're responsible to use them in a way that truly is going to advance the kingdom of God. And so with that in mind, that money can change us for the better or it can change us for the worse, let me take a few minutes and just look at a passage from Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 21. And Jesus told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all of my grain and my goods, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will give you what you've prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. What are we talking about? Being rich about things that matter the most. And this is what Jesus says in this story, that he wants us to be rich towards God. That's what he wants us to be. And so the prosperity test is to see if we're capable of handling real blessings in our lives. See, God is always evaluating my life by how I deal with, the areas of prosperity in my life. It may be material prosperity. It could be other areas of achievement or accomplishment, other areas of giftedness or capabilities. Whatever it is that we are blessed with, then I think God is always looking at and saying, how do you take those things I've given you? And what are the primary gifts that God gives us? First is the gift of time. I'd call that the gift of life. Is that correct? He gives us the gift of talents and abilities. And those are things that only come from God because God says, listen, I'm going to gift you in those kinds of ways. And then we have these blessings materially, financially, that I talked about over the last few minutes. And so when God blesses our lives in some way, then He is testing whether we're capable of handling real blessings. And so I think that test results in really, evaluating several key areas of our lives. I would just put test number one, does God give us more so we can accumulate more? Now, the passage I just read a few moments ago from Luke chapter 12, this guy has this amazing, abundant harvest. And he says, what am I going to do with it? So instead of thinking like someone who is changed for the better whenever they are blessed materially, instead of thinking like that, he starts thinking how? Like I described a few moments ago. He starts thinking arrogantly. He starts thinking selfishly. He becomes overconfident. And see, it's key to keep in mind that God does not give us more just to accumulate more. A couple weekends ago, I talked about how many of us live by the stack and how we look at it and say, if I've got a stack that's this tall, I will be more secure if I have a stack that's this tall. And if I have a stack that's this tall, I'll be more secure when I have a stack that's this tall. And far too many times, I don't think we're really understanding that God blesses us. Why does Jesus say that He blesses us? If you look at the last verse, verse 21, this will be how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich towards God. So God says, Rick Addison, I will bless you in a variety of ways, but I want you to use those blessings to be rich towards me. When I begin to understand that, then I am passing the prosperity test. Because it's at that point I realize that God's not blessed me to accumulate more. He has blessed me to become a humbler person, to become a more grateful person, to become a more generous person, and to accept greater responsibilities to serve Him with those talents, gifts, and time that He's given to me. The second test is this. When God gives us more, then He expects more from us. And look at verses 20 and 21. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you prepared for yourself? And this is how it is when you store up things for yourself, but are not rich towards God. He is making it very clear that God says, I want you to understand that because I have blessed you, I expect more out of you. Now, I am the oldest of 5 siblings. And I can remember over and over my mom and dad saying, anytime we had a little problem, they'd say, Rick, we expect more out of you than that. Now, I'll tell you something. I love my mom and dad, and the last thing I wanted was for them to think that they could trust me more, that they could believe me more, and me disappoint them. And I can't tell you how many times I heard them say, we expected more out of you than that. And here I am, a full-grown adult, and still I recognize that God is saying to me, Rick, I expect more out of you than that. I'm not expecting you to be focused on yourself. I'm not expecting you to be focused on your agenda. I am expecting more out of you. And whenever God blesses us, He is what? Expecting more out of us. And that's why this guy he's described as a fool. That's how Jesus describes him in the story. Because what he didn't understand was who it was that made him rich. And who was it that had made this guy rich? God Himself. Say, how did God make him rich? Well, God made the rain rain. Is that correct? On his crop. He's making it rain around here a little more than I enjoy. But He made the rain rain, and because of that, he had this abundant crop. He made the sun shine, and because of that, he had this amazing crop. He made the crops grow. The farmer had planted the seed, but God multiplied the seed. So what we've got to keep in mind is this, that God is the one who gives us everything we have. And God gave this guy abundant crops, not for him to build bigger barns, not for him to say, I am going to eat, drink, and be merry. God gave him this abundant harvest because God was expecting more out of him than to be focused on himself. And I think that's important to understand, that God is the source of everything we have in our lives. And because of that, He expects more out of us. And then, test number 3, God calls us fools if we don't pass the prosperity test. You say, really, Rick, I would never think of doing that. Well, first of all, you're not a farmer, so you don't think like one. We are who we are. My barns are not building bigger barns to store crops in, all right? For me, my bigger barns can be related to a bank account. It can be related to other things in my life that are a part of just the things I like and love. And there's nothing wrong with having more in your bank account, unless it makes us arrogant, unless it makes us selfish, unless it makes us a tightwad. See, we've got to keep in mind that God says if we don't pass the prosperity test, then we have done a very foolish thing. And so if you've got gifts you're not using, God says you're not passing the blessing test I've given you in your life. If you have time that you're not investing in serving in some capacity, then He says you are not passing the prosperity test. If you're not honoring God by selflessly and generously doing whatever it is you can do with the resources He's given you materially, then He says He describes us as a fool. And I think it's important to keep that in perspective. Over the past 3 weekends, we've kind of been building this key statement. And it's in your notes, and if you don't have your notes out there in your program. And this is the key statement. And let's read it together and not be timid about it. How about that? All right? God has blessed me with more than I need. I am rich, but I will not trust in my riches, but in Him who richly provides. Because I have more, I will give more. And what are we adding to it? And I will do more. I will do more. Doing more is passing the prosperity test. And that's why it's so important to keep in mind that that's what God is communicating to all of us. And so I would challenge us today to understand that God says, I bless you to determine whether or not you're capable of handling real blessings. My experience in life has been this, and walking with Jesus, the more I pass His prosperity test. And when I talk about that, I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about this thing called time, this thing called talents, this thing called money, all right? The more consistent I am in passing His prosperity test in my life, the more God expects out of me and the more responsibilities He gives me. And I think that's an important thing for us to not forget and to understand. If we really want to be used by God, then we have to pass the prosperity test. And the good news about prosperity is this. And if you look at Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, Jesus says, "Do not store up yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So Jesus says, don't store up your treasures on earth, because they will not last. You know, John D. Rockefeller, in his generation, was one of the wealthiest men that ever lived. And when he died, an accountant, a reporter asked his accountant, wanted to know how much John D. Rockefeller was worth. How much money did John D. leave? The accountant thought about it for a moment, and he said this: he left all of it. He didn't give him a number. He said he left all of it. And guess what? We all leave all of it. Every one of us does. And see, we've got to keep in mind that earthly treasures do not last. Either they leave us or we leave them. All right? One way or the other, they don't last. As I've told you a variety of times, I have presided over hundreds and hundreds of funerals and memorial services. I have been the second car in those funeral processions hundreds of times. So I'm right behind the hearse. And I've got a full view of it. And I can promise you, I haven't even seen a hearse yet that has a hitch on it. Say nothing of pulling a trailer with people's goods in it. And just look yourself and see if you find one with a hitch on it, all right? Now, you may find some old aging hippie who drives around in one of those old aging hearses who has one, but I'm talking about one carrying people to a cemetery. And it's important to keep in mind, either the treasures don't last or we leave them. So one way or the other, we've got to keep this in mind, that it's foolish to store up all our treasures on this planet because they do not last. And then Jesus says you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Each of us were made for a person and made for a place. And Jesus is that person, and that place is heaven. And it's important to keep that in mind. So I was made for a person. That's Jesus Christ. I was made for a place, and that's called heaven. And I've got to understand how important that is. And so Jesus says, lay up your treasures in the hands of the person of Jesus Christ and place them in heaven. You say, well, how in the world can you do that? Well, I promise you FedEx isn't going to take it there. You have to do it through giving of your time, giving of your talents, giving of your treasures. It is then when I invest those things in serving Jesus Christ, that person, that those things are then stored up in heaven. And you remember what Jesus said? You never so much as give a cup of cold water in my name, but what? There is a reward for it in heaven. So let me encourage us to understand that everything that we do that is generous, everything we do that is giving, everything we do that is selfless in serving Jesus Christ, if we do it in His name, there is an eternal treasure associated with that. Now, let's just say that your home is France. That's your home country. And you're visiting America for, say, 3 months. And you're living in a hotel. And here's the rule. You can't take anything back with you to France. But if you earn money, you can wire the deposits from the United States to your bank account in France. So let me ask you this. You can't take anything you accumulate in your hotel room with you, but you can send it on ahead and it'll be waiting for you. So let me ask you, how much junk are you going to accumulate in that hotel room over 3 months? Not much. You're going to say, I am going to send it where? Home. And Bible makes it clear that heaven is our eternal home. And yet, far too often, Rick Addison lives his life like if I can accumulate a little more stuff and I accumulate a few more things, and there's nothing wrong with some nice stuff. There's nothing wrong with some nice things. But let's keep in mind that none of that can be taken with us. But what I send ahead can be and will be. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. See, Jesus says our investments in heavenly treasure are completely safe from loss. And he points out that earthly treasures are always subject to uncertainty, rust, moths, thieves. Those are the perils of earthly investments. Now, when you came in, I assume you noticed you were given $2 bills. Is that right? Do you know what one of them is? One of them's a fake. Is that right? So if you go trying to use it, you're going to go to jail. How about that? All right? Okay. There's one of them that's fake. Which one's fake? Which hand's my fake one in? My left hand. That's right. You're right, but my left hand. All right. So here's the thing to keep in mind. You look at it and say, how much is this worth? Nothing. Don't go try to spend it. You will not even buy an ice cube with that thing. All right? This one right here keeps getting worth less and less last I checked. But let me let you on a little secret. Let me ask you this. How much Greek currency from 2,000 years ago is useful today? None. Is that correct? How much Roman currency from 2,000 years ago is useful or usable today? None. Is that correct? At one point, there were people, whenever Greece was dominating the world, and Rome was dominating the world, they would look at it and said, stashing away all the Roman money I can stash away is the most important thing. But everything they stashed is what? Worthless. Is that correct? And you can say, boy, I'm going to stash all of these greenbacks away I can stash. But don't ever forget, one day, this will be what? Worthless is what it will be. And I want to encourage you, you can do with that one whatever you want. Some of you may put it in the offering bucket. If you do, add a few others with it. If not, I think the best thing you could do with these actually is not put it in an offering bucket. Take them both home and put them somewhere where you take care of the financial affairs in your life, and maybe tape it to a wall right in front of you where you're reminded that all of those things that you're so focused on is really what? Very temporary, and one day will be what? Completely worthless. The good news is this. Every time I take one of these things and I invest this some way in the kingdom of Christ, there's an eternal dividend. In fact, Jesus says that when you do that he gives us a 10,000% increase. I sat down one day and calculated if you took $1 and you earned 10,000% interest on it, where it would be in 5 years. It's a staggering number. Staggering number. All I'm trying to communicate to us today is this, that we need to keep in mind all of these things that we see as important will one day be totally, completely, absolutely worthless. Somebody was telling me just a little while ago in a meeting we had that they saw on TV where, Venezuela is in a real tragic mess. I believe that the inflation rate's around 1,000% a month or something like that. And how somebody was going to get a loaf of bread and had a stack of money like this to buy it. Now let me tell you something. All of this stuff some of us spend our lives focusing on could more quickly than we imagine be completely worthless. So I just want to encourage you, put it somewhere where you'll be reminded of that, and when you do, God will use it to help us to live for the right things. And then Jesus says investing in heavenly treasures pays huge dividends. And, we're happy with an earthly investment that just returns a modest, you get a modest return on. And the things that God says we will benefit from through eternal investments are things that are such a vast reward, we cannot hardly even calculate the measurements of it. And with all that in mind, let me give you then 6 prosperity principles that if we want to be rich in what matters the most, these are really important things to be aware of. In Luke chapter 12, verses 32 through 34, just a few verses down from that passage I read a few minutes ago, Jesus says, "Fear not, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide money belts for yourself that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will not be exhausted, for your heart will always be where your riches are." Let me just give you the first prosperity principle, and that is God owns everything, and we are his manager. 1 Corinthians 4:2 says, "Now the most important thing about a servant is that he does just what his master tells him to do." Throughout the scriptures, God says, it all belongs to me, and you're just a manager of what belongs to him. In Psalm 24, the psalmist says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and the world and all who live in it." Leviticus 25, "The land is mine, and you are but an alien and my tenants. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine." And God is reminding us that he is the one that owns it all. And sometimes we think by our ingenuity, we think by our capabilities, we think by our skills that we have done it all. And God says, never forget that I am the owner of all of it, and you are nothing more nor less than a steward that manages a portion of what God owns. And then the second prosperity principle is this: prosperity reveals the true condition of our heart. Matthew 6:21, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." I think it's important for us to realize that there are certain things that tell us the condition of our heart. One is, what is my attitude towards the blessings God gives me in my life? And so am I focused on, material things, or am I focused on the things that advance the kingdom of God? And, so whatever my treasure is, that's where my heart will be. And I can tell you that I can see an awful lot about where my heart is by what my money is spent on, by what my time is spent on, what my talents are spent on. So really it's out of those kinds of things I can evaluate the condition of my heart. And then the Bible tells us that out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so whatever comes out of my mouth, whatever comes out of my hands, will be a great indication of the condition of my heart. And then heaven, not earth, is our real home. Hebrews 11:13 through 16. They admitted they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show they're looking for a country of their own. Instead, they're longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, and he's prepared a city for them. I think one of the greatest things that we need to keep in mind is this: this world is not our home. This is just a temporary dwelling place. It is not our home. And that's why God says that, that he has a country all for us. And that's the eternal city that he has prepared for us. See, we're on earth on a short-term visa. And we're not here that long. If you live 40, 60, 80, or 100 years, you're not here very long on this planet. And then we should live for the line and not the dot. I think that too many times we live for the dot. We live for the present. We live for the moment. When God says, I want you to live for the line, is what I want you to do. I want you to think not short term. I want you to think long term. I don't want you to think earthly. I want you to think eternal. And when we start understanding that, it makes such a difference. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 25 and 26, Moses demonstrates what it's like to live for the line and not for the dot. Moses chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. That's the dot. Choosing to be mistreated with the people of God was living for the line. And this is what it goes on and says, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as greater values than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking forward to his reward. That's living for the line. And far too many of us, I think, live for the dot. And see, the pleasures of this world are so momentary. They're so short. They're so brief. And God says it is not smart to live by the dot. It is wise to live by the line. And keep in mind that we've got to understand that we live for the line, because everything that's a part of this world will all go back in the box. Let me share a video clip with you that I think illustrates that in a fantastic way.
Now, my grandmother was a wonderful person. She taught me how to play the game Monopoly. She understood that the name of the game is to acquire. She would accumulate everything she could, and eventually she became the master of the board. And eventually, every time, she would take my last dollar, and I would quit in utter defeat. And then she would always say the same thing to me. She'd look at me and she'd say, one day, you'll learn to play the game. One summer, I played Monopoly with a neighbor almost every day, all day long. We'd play Monopoly for hours. And that summer, I learned to play the game. I came to understand the only way to win is to make a total commitment to acquisition. I came to understand that money and possessions, that's the way that you keep score. And by the end of that summer, I was more ruthless than my grandmother. I was ready to bend the rules if I had to win that game. And I sat down with her to play that fall. I took everything she had. I destroyed her financially and psychologically. I watched her give her last dollar and quit in utter defeat. And then she had one more thing to teach me. Then she said, now it all goes back in the box. All those houses and hotels, all the railroads and utility companies, all that property and all that wonderful money, in the box, and I'm going to lose it all. That's not much of an ROI on that. So you have to ask yourself, when you finally get the ultimate promotion, when you've made the ultimate purchase, when you buy the ultimate home, when you have stored up financial security and climbed the ladder of success to the highest rung you can possibly climb it, and the thrill wears off, and it will wear off, then what? How far do you have to walk down that road before you see where it leads? Surely you understand, it'll never be enough. So you have to ask yourself the question, what matters?
I think that we need to understand that everything goes back in the box. All those things we acquire, all of those things we accumulate, all those achievements in our life, they all go back in the box. Say, Rick, that's a little pessimistic. Well, it is if that's what you're living for, okay? It is. But if you're living for something bigger than that, and I would just point out that the test of prosperity is not the accumulating all the houses and all the hotels and all the money and all those kinds of things. The test of prosperity is, do we understand that it does all go back in the box? Every bit of it. You know, you can win the game of Monopoly, but when the game is over, guess what? Everything goes back in the box. And we must never forget that. And remember how important it is to understand that we don't live for the dot, we live for the line. And that makes all the difference in the world. And then I would point out that giving is the only antidote to materialism. 1 Timothy 6, 9, and 10. People want to get rich, fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Let me just encourage us to realize how unbelievably important it is that we recognize that God says the antidote to living your life with the accumulation of stuff is to be a generous person. I talked about that last week, and I'm not going to repeat myself. And then God gives us prosperity to raise our standard of giving, not to raise our standard of living. Malachi 3:10, God says, test me in this to see if I won't open the heavens and pour out blessings upon you when you give more than you can handle. Jesus says in Luke 6:38, give and it will be given to you, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over to be poured into your lap. For the measure you use is the measure will be measured to you. And let me just put it this way. Whenever we understand that God blesses us not to accumulate more, but He blesses us to give more. When we start understanding that, then we begin to realize that that solves the problem of having too much. It solves the problem of being focused on the wrong things on this planet. God abundantly provides for us, not for us to hoard it, but He abundantly provides for it to be used by Him to be a source of great blessing to other people. You know, let's just say that you and I were having this conversation, and I said, you know, I'll give you $1,000 to go spend any way you want. And you say, wow, Rick, that's a good deal. I already know what I'm going to spend the $1,000 on. And you say, well, you have to choose. You have to choose whether you want $1,000 today or a year from now. If you don't take that $1,000 for today and go spend it, if you're willing to wait, I'll give you $10 million. You say, I think I'll take the $10 million. So we would then focus not on today and spending the $1,000. We would focus on 12 months from now having the $10 million. And I think that when Jesus says, don't store up yourself wealth in this world, but store for yourself treasures in heaven. He is communicating to us, listen, you can take the $1,000 today. You can go use it any way that you choose to use it. Or you can look at it and say, there's an eternity of blessings waiting for you if you pass the test of prosperity in your life. And let me tell you something. I would think it's important for us to realize that if you live for a long time on this planet, as I said a few moments ago, it's still a very, very short period of time. And that's why it is so important for us to realize that God is saying to all of us, don't take the $1,000 for today. Focus on the 10 million for eternity and realize that I've got something so amazing for you if you will simply focus on the right kinds of things. You know, I would invite you to take a little walk next door. Snake Road Auto Salvage. Take a walk back through there. All you have to do is just tell them you need to get a side view mirror and go back and buy it. Take a walk through there. And you know, they've got those cars. You know, I do most of my own repair work, so I'm familiar with it. They've got those cars and everything else lined up together. They've got all the Buicks lined up together. They've got all the Cadillacs lined up together. They've got all the SUVs lined up together by model and make. And I want you to look at those cars and realize that one day somebody drove them off of a dealer's lot. When you buy a car like that, and I don't have to buy new cars, but if you buy a new car, you buy it with the idea this is going to last for what? A long time. Is that right? And maybe it will. But ultimately, it will end up over there. And we must never forget that. You know, if you go by Mount Trashmore, and they're all over South Florida, if you don't know where you're at and you smell that god-awful smell, you know you're by Mount Trashmore. If you were to go to Mount Trashmore and start digging through Mount Trashmore, you would discover that there were birthday presents there that had ended up where? In the dump. Is that right? You would discover that there are, you know, anniversary presents that ended up where? In the dump. And far too many times, we don't live with the awareness that those things are so temporary. And God says, listen, everything on this earth is going to be burned. So don't put your hope in things that moth and rust can destroy. And thieves can break in and steal. But put your treasures in heaven, where moth and rust and thieves cannot take it away. And I want to challenge us today to realize when we understand that, we have passed the prosperity test. And that's what God wants us to do. God, I come to you right now, very aware that you're speaking to many of us about focusing our values on the things that really do matter. And I pray today that your Holy Spirit will work in amazing ways in our lives, helping us, God, to just be aware that all of us are so blessed. Every one of us in this room is blessed, first of all, by the incredible gift of time, because we're still breathing, we're still, able to function, we're still able to use this gift of life that you've given to us. God, I just pray we'll use it in a way that demonstrates that we understand how blessed we are. For those of us, God, that are here, all of us have talents and abilities that you want to work through. And I just pray you'll help us to invest those in serving you. And then, God, all of us are so rich. And I pray we'll take those abundant blessings you've given to us and use them to store up treasures in heaven. And I thank you for all the things you're going to do in our lives now. And then, Father, I just pray for those who've come here who do not have a personal relationship with you, that they would say, Jesus, thank you for dying as my substitute on the cross. I ask you to forgive me for all of my sins. I accept your gift of grace and mercy and forgiveness. I ask you to come into my life and to take complete control. And I surrender myself to you today. And I want to be the man, woman, boy or girl that you created me to be. And I want to live every day of my life in a way that reflects authentic and genuine faith in you. And I ask this in the name of my Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, I want to encourage us to really allow God to work in a special way in these areas of our lives. And I know as we do, that He's going to do some pretty amazing things that we would never dream possible. Keep in mind that you can put the names of people praying for their salvation on these windows in the front of our auditorium before you go. Genesis 28:20 through 22, Jacob makes a vow to God. He said, God, if you'll be with me and watch over me, I'll give all that you give me, I'll give you a tenth. Just reminding us of the unbelievable importance of putting God first in our lives. I'm going to ask the ushers to come. We're going to worship the Lord by returning our tithes and our offerings to the place of worship. And while they're receiving those offerings, I'd remind you can get a CD of today's service at no charge by going to the information desk in the lobby, and they'll be ready in just a few minutes. And then if you've not, if you are a first-time attender, I want to encourage you to stop by our guest area, and we have a gift for you that we'd like to give you and also to get acquainted with you. Also remember that you can make donations at our kiosk on either side of the lobby or in the boxes in the tunnels. And then tonight, we're going to be showing the Fireproof movie over in the Connection Center facilities. I think there's pizza that goes with that, if I remember correctly. And that is for those of you that are married couples. And I think you'll find that to be a really nice time. And they'll be showing the Fireproof movie. And then tomorrow we will be having our annual Waterpalooza summer event. And I want to encourage you to be back here around 12:30 for that. That will be in the Connection Center facility. And please join us for that time of great fun and food and fellowship. You know, we're called the grazing place for a reason, aren't we? And then keep in mind that you receive prayer support for any need in your life over here. On this side of the auditorium, there'll be communion served over here. And our bookstore will be open. And let me thank you for your incredible attention tonight. And apologize for going a little bit longer than I should have. But we're glad you are here. Let's stand together, and the band's going to come and lead us in a time of celebration in preparation for beginning a brand new week.